Welcome to the College Checklist podcast by March Consulting College Planning and Higher Scores Test Prep, where we make the confusing chaos of the college admissions process simple as possible. As we're entering into this new era of testing and admissions, we are bringing you a new guide to application season with a whole new team of experts and guests. So, for this particular episode, we're tackling test optional policies, which is a whole mess. So if you have a junior or senior in high school and you're trying to decipher what test optional and test blind and test required and all that stuff means, if you're hearing that, like, oh, no one needs to take the SAT anymore, don't even bother, don't even think about it, but that just doesn't sound right to you, this is the episode for you. So we're talking about test optional admissions policies, what they are, why are they like this, and what do they mean for your student? First, let me introduce myself. I'm Julia. I'm the test prep expert here. I write the curriculum and teach the SAT, ACT, PSAT courses for higher scores test prep. And I have a lovely co-host here with me, Christina. Introduce yourself, Christina.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christina. I am an independent educational consultant with March Consulting, which means that I'm the admissions expert because I have spent the last 5+ years helping students and families navigate the admissions policies of the colleges that they're applying to. So, to get us started in this conversation about test policies in admissions, let's go ahead and define some of the terms that you'll hear when you start looking at schools and their policies, like the good old-fashioned test required, which does say pretty outright what that plan means. It means that you are required to submit a test score for consideration as a part of their admissions process. And the truth is this has been the standard for most universities. There was the pandemic shakeup that we're going to address in a bit, but it used to be pretty expected that many institutions would be requiring test scores. It has since become a hallmark of the elite university systems, as certain schools who paused their requirements during the pandemic are now switching back and requiring test scores again, like MIT and Dartmouth, who both switched back to requiring tests just in the last 3 years. And there are current universities announcing every day that they too are joining the group of schools going back to requiring test scores. That has always meant that a student could take the SAT or the ACT, but they got to pick one and include that at least in their application. Kind of the opposite of test required then is the term test blind, which means that the institution will not look at test scores. Even if you have them, they're not going to consider them as a factor in their admissions decisions. That includes both admissions and for scholarships for financial aid. The biggest example of this is the UC system that announced that they would switch to test blind about 2020, 2021. So a 1600 is not going to get you in to UCLA. Now, it can still be relevant for students entering the UC system, and we'll talk about ways that scores can still be important regardless. But yes, the UCs, the Cal State system in California, there are schools who will not consider your scores as a factor in their considerations when they are looking at students and making their admissions decisions. But of course, there's a whole lot of other options and in-betweens. So Julia, why don't you take us through some of the other policies schools have implemented?
Yeah. So there's two different policies that sound really similar. So we're going to differentiate them. So first, there's test flexible. And this is where you probably are required or encouraged to submit a test score, but it doesn't have to be a particular test. So it could be an AP test or a collection of AP tests or IB tests if you do those, SAT or ACT, whichever test is going to make you look the best, whichever is the most relevant to your application, whatever makes you feel the most confident is what you can submit. So they want to see something, but they're less picky. So NYU and Yale actually currently use these policies. So Yale does require a test, but they are more flexible on what kind. And then we get into test optional. So this is the messy bit that a lot of schools have found themselves in that's a lot less defined. So this basically means that you are allowed to choose whether or not you submit a score. And what this has sort of shaken out to is that a lot of students who aren't getting like above like a 1550 or something are just like choosing not to submit their scores because they're worried it makes them look worse. And so the sort of average test score has increased by quite a bit. There is some research to suggest there's a pretty strong correlation between students with higher income or whose parents have more education ending up with higher test scores. And so, students who are submitting these scores, it can be a way for the test optional schools to kind of get a sense of your income potentially, or um, gather a general idea of your background, even if you haven't told them. Um, it's a little messy at times. Not obviously not all schools do that, but it is kind of an indicator. So self-selecting out of that submission can potentially impact you negatively, as is submitting a really low score could also impact you negatively. It's complicated. um, Schools like Vanderbilt and Northwestern and all of the Georgia State universities are currently test optional, but they're in these kind of temporary policies with a time limit of about 2 or 3 years. So that could kind of change at any time. There have been some schools who were saying, oh, we're going to stay like this until 2026. And then on a dime, this past 6 months, they've flipped and been like, actually, we're requiring them now. We recommend you submit them this fall and you have 5 months, So there has been, there's a lot of instability in the sense of like, we don't quite know which schools are going to be like this long term. So that's another aspect to the test optional is it's been presented as this temporary thing for a lot of places, and they're kind of non-committal about whether or not they're going to keep using it. They're kind of gathering data on whether or not it works for them, and helps them reach certain metrics. And so, and every school is a bit different in exactly what they're prioritizing in that decision, obviously.
And I
Um,
think people would be surprised at how quickly, how often things continue to change in this
yes.
industry. There
Yeah.
was a story of a fellow IEC visiting a school about 15 days away from their application cycle resetting, the new application coming out. And this IEC was asking the school, because they were at the school visiting, will there be new essays when you do this in 15 days when we get access to this new version of your application? Will there be additional essays? And the representative could not tell them because they still were not sure themselves if they were
Uh-huh.
going to do that. So you would be surprised how soon things can change, how suddenly things can change, no matter where we're at in the process of the admission cycle.
Yeah. And you also don't know um, where a test optional school sort of prioritizes a test. Like, is it the first thing they look at? Is it the last thing they look at? Is it a deciding factor, or is it like, eh, you know, eh, every admissions system has sort of different priorities and what they're looking for when they're putting together a class, and they have different metrics of percentages that they're trying to meet in order to build a complete student body. um, and so every school could be different in terms of how important that test score is. And then there's also sort of caveats for some test optional schools where, like, if you're applying to a specific engineering or nursing program that's super competitive, they might require a test, whereas the rest of the school doesn't. Um, or out of state or international students might be required to have a particular type of test score that in state students don't. So there could potentially be fine print on this sort of test optional label. And so um, just assuming, oh, because it's test optional, that means test scores don't matter, is a big mistake. I think is the conclusion we can come to. But we'll get into that a bit later. So, can you walk us through how did we get here, Christina? Like, where, why did, how did we get into this mess
Yeah.
that we're currently in? And like, what do you see as kind of the future going forward of what these policies are going to look like?
Yeah, so educational research has shown that when a student understands the why behind the concept that they're working with, they will remember it better and longer and be more flexible with that concept. So let's talk about the why, or at least for those
Yeah.
of you that are historically inclined. Yes, the schools largely used to require test scores. It didn't matter SAT or ACT, they would accept one of these two. But then two kind of major things happened. First, there was a criticism of the UC's admissions system. And it was pointed out that perhaps requiring test scores for students to apply was unfair. Because even outside of the pandemic, there were reasons that some students weren't able to test and therefore unable to apply. So that got challenged kind of pre COVID, and that launched a whole investigation and reconsidering of things. In the meantime, then COVID happened and test sites shut down. There was no information about when students might be able to access testing again. So a lot of schools kind of paused requiring test scores at that point. Outside of the UC system, that's when we saw Harvard and Yale and the Ivies, and a lot of schools kind of recognize the position that students were in and say, all right, as a matter of fact, they said, this is a good time for this, because if the UCs are being challenged for fairness, we should do some research. We should reevaluate. How much value does this bring to our admissions process? And so they paused. Schools went test optional that weren't previously test optional. This was good for a lot of schools because it kind of increased their applicant numbers. In some cases, those students who, again, used to self select, well, I don't have a 1600, so I won't apply to Stanford. Now that that wasn't a requirement, they looked at their 4.4 GPA and said, hey, that's just as strong as the next guy. I'll throw my hat in the ring too. So applications went up, yes, at more selective schools, but also at some of those schools that we don't hear about as often, some of those schools that don't have quite the reputation of an Ivy. They saw an increased number of applications as well. And with that, an increased number of application fee payments, and with that, an increase in their selectivity,
Mm.
because the number of spots they had available did not grow, just the number of applicants because of this decision. So their admission rates went a little lower. That makes them look more selective, which in the US especially, we think makes them look exclusive and therefore more valuable. It was also unhelpful, though, for some schools because with that increase in applicants, an increase in attendance as well, naturally that means more students potentially dropping out when they discover that maybe it's not quite the right time for them, not the right program for them, all the various reasons that that happens at every institution. If you're increasing the population, you're increasing the risk of that. So their dropout rates at some schools also increased, which is not good for the optics, as we say in PR. Didn't make them look good as far as they were concerned. So there were some goods, some bads from test optional. I can tell you that we were looking at the data for the first round of schools who released their admission rates after going test optional, because the phrasing is meant to imply that it will be equally fair if a student applies and includes their test scores or not. They're going to get an equally fair shot of being accepted. They're going to be considered in a fair way, whatever that means. So we were looking at the data, and yes, at some schools it did look kind of 50-50. Half of the students they admitted had included test scores, half had not. At other schools, there was a higher admission rate for students that had included test scores. There's many reasons that might be, though, not just because maybe the college was favoring students that included their scores. Again, if it's optional, then the only students who are going to choose to volunteer their scores are ones who know they have good ones. So, yes, that those students were including higher test scores. Often students with good test scores do tend to have the solid GPA and some of those other things that schools are looking for. So there could be various reasons that they had higher admission rates. But it was an interesting time to be looking at data, to be looking at which schools were providing their data, because not everyone does. Okay, but now that we're post COVID, now that some of that has settled, where do we still see some movement, some shifting plates, if you will, in this industry? I mean, we are still kind of in a transitional period where schools are either coming to the end of that temporary test optional period that they had set up. And so it's time for them to make some decisions. Are they going to extend that policy to next year? Are they going to make changes? I can tell you, working with juniors right now, researching potential colleges for their applications next year, sometimes we will get to websites that very clearly say, we are going to continue to be test optional for this current admission year. And then there's no more information, which leaves a person wondering, what about next year?
Mm.
Why aren't they commenting on that? Why can't we get answers? Some schools are still deciding and may make some changes. Um, in the last 6 months, we've seen a slew of those prestigious universities going back to test required, like MIT, like Dartmouth, like Harvard. Um, on the other hand, the UCs, the Cal States, they are committing to their test blind policies, which makes sense when you think about the origins of their change versus COVID related change. But yeah, it is not expected that the UCs will backtrack. They will continue to be test blind. And then we've got that middle ground of test optional schools who might stick that way. Because while the majority of schools used to require test scores, there have been colleges that never did. There have been colleges that have been test optional from the start. They found that a beneficial practice for their institution, so it makes sense that others would and would continue to do it. Um, so test optional will continue to be a thing. And in truth, if there were reasons a student could not test or at least simply couldn't demonstrate the understanding that they want on their score on a test, if a student needed, we absolutely could build a list around schools that are test optional. But in most cases, when it comes to admissions, when it comes to scholarships, when it comes to special programs, when it comes to standing out amongst an ever growing population of applicants, having a solid test score can really go a long way. So in the future, we do expect that we will see schools continuing to make that decision for themselves. We do know that some of those changes may be last minute. It can be really tough on a senior who wasn't planning on testing to hear of changes right now in their academic year when it comes to opportunities for continued testing. So for the next 2 or 3 years, students likely will not be able to say for certain until a few months even before their application is due what the testing policy is for their school. They'll want to keep touching base with their school's website and verifying the policies to make sure that they have what they need when it comes time to hit submit. However, we can expect a lot of schools to stay test optional for the long term. So we will continue to see those institutions and those opportunities for our students as well.
Yeah. So it's not like if access to a test is really not an option for you, or um, just really not the best way to make you stand out, there will always be opportunities for students like that, plenty of opportunities. Um, but in general, when how do we use all this information to make personal choices, figuring out what's the best thing for you? There is no longer a one size fits all anymore. There is no longer well, you have to have a test, so here's your two options. Pick the one that's best for you. It's a lot more complicated now. There's a lot more factors to consider. So, first, remember that test optional or test blind can mean more competition because there's more applicants in that year, and also more scrutiny on other parts of your application, right? So those other parts now have to look really good in order to get you into that school, right? So do you have a really strong essay, a really strong GPA, lots of extracurriculars? Uh, this could be fine for you. Like that might be the best way to make you have a really strong application. Great. But make sure that, those things that you're putting together are a really good fit for the specific school you're applying to, especially the essays, because you no longer have that other sort of pillar piece to sort of make you stand out. Another thing I would say is read the fine print often, regularly and often, because look into the very specific program that you're applying to, or there are several schools within a university. There might be a school of engineering, a school of business, and those schools might have different policies that impact your major that you're applying to. Don't just look and see if the school is test optional right now and call it a day, because they might make a different decision for next year. They might have specific requirements for out of state students, international students, students in certain programs. Check and see whether they use test scores for anything else. Speaking of which, you probably will need test scores for other things. Even the University of California system, which is completely test blind for admissions and financial aid, will still sometimes request an SAT or ACT score for freshman course placement. So deciding which English class or which math class you get into could be determined by your SAT score. So even they use it for something. Um, and most importantly, I would argue, test scores are really important for saving money on college, because college just keeps getting more and more and more expensive. So they can help you a lot with merit-based aid, because merit-based aid is based on how strong of a student you are, and that makes you look like a really strong student. And they are often requirements to when you apply for scholarships. So need-based aid is different, right? That's just based on your family's income and various other things. But any kind of merit aid scholarships you're applying for, you're going to want a test score in your back pocket for that. And above average, I would say. Doesn't need to be a 1600, but above average. And then you don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? So schools on your list could change their mind like the June before you apply. And now you maybe have two chances to take the SAT before you have to submit your scores. And that's cutting it real close. So you won't regret having a score ready to go, even if you just take it once and it's a little above average. And you're like, all the schools I'm applying to right now are test optional, but I want to have this in my back pocket just in case. And then one of them changes their mind and they're like requiring a test now. Then you're like, ooh, I have at least one score ready to go. Let me take it one more time and see if I can do a little better now that I'm familiar with it, right? Like you're so much better prepared than another student. Um, so really don't wait until it's too late. Like make smart decisions. Make smart decisions that are best for you and your goals. Don't just assume sort of a blanket like, "Oh, these aren't required. I don't need it. I don't even need to think about it." Mm-mm-mm. Everyone needs to think about it and then make an educated decision. So that is where I would conclude. Um, is that it's probably worth having one. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And sometimes I think my students must think I have some kind of anxiety disorder with how often I'm reminding them, like, go double check the test policies and you want to register as early as you can to make sure that you have that seat saved. But this
Mhm.
all comes from having watched these issues crop up over the years.
Mhm.
Having
Mhm.
watched a student try to scramble to get a last minute score, having watched a student have to choose not to go to the homecoming game because they had to take that SAT the next Saturday
Ooh.
because it was the only chance they had. So I
Mhm.
want to save you some of those difficulties, and I'm trying to warn you about the things that you could be doing now to help prevent that from happening to you in the future.
Yeah. Don't let it happen to you.
Yeah.
You won't regret it.
No. All right, folks, that is all for today. If you'd like to contact Julia or myself directly, you can send admission questions to me at info@mymarchconsulting.com and testing questions to Julia at hello@higherscorestestprep.com. Those will be linked in the show notes below, so you can grab those addresses there as well. If you would like a free college planning consultation, go to our website, mymarchconsulting.com/services, and check out higherscorestestprep.com to take our SAT versus ACT quiz. Which one's for you? Or download our free guides to the SAT and the ACT, or maybe sign up for a test prep course since we've told you how important it is to try it and do your best at it. This
Maybe.
has been the College Checklist Podcast with Julia and Christina. See you next time, and thanks for listening.
Bye.